Kenya on edge. Political tension is running high after former Prime Minister Raila Odinga holds a rally against what he calls the government's many failures. The demonstration was staged after a series of attacks in the country. So will these sorts of rallies only fuel more chaos in Kenya? And who's to blame for the recurrent violence? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Bah Thibault. Political tensions have resurfaced in Kenya amid a recent rise in violence. Opposition leader Raila Odinga held a rally in Nairobi on Monday to demand a dialogue with the government. The demonstration coincides with Saba Saba Day, which commemorates pro-democracy protests in 1990 when security forces killed more than 100 people. The former Prime Minister says it's time to address the government's many failures that include the worsening crime rate, a rise in the cost of living and allegations of ethnic favoritism. Al Jazeera's Catherine Soy helps set up our discussion from Kisumu in Western Kenya.
Here in Kisumu, Western Kenya, the crowds shout anti-government slogans. Uhuru must go, they chant, referring to the president, Uhuru Kenyatta. The opposition Coalition for Reform and Democracy, led by former Prime Minister Raila Odinga, was not short of supporters. This is an opposition stronghold. Politicians have been using such rallies to pressure the government to call for a national dialogue. Security, corruption, tribalism and electoral reforms top the list of issues they say have taken the country to the brink of a crisis.
It is the executive that wields the instruments of power. So it is the executive that we want to engage along with the legislature. So we must go beyond the confines of a legislative debate.
The government insists that any dialogue must happen here, inside Parliament. Odinga's coalition wants direct talks with the president. The political standoff between the ruling and the opposition coalitions has heightened tension in the country. The director of the National Cohesion Commission says it's not the time for grandstanding.
Yeah, it's bringing a lot of hostility, I think, among Kenyans. There's a lot of ethnicity issues coming up. There's a lot of abuse. And so it's not a very good thing for this country. It divides the people.
7th July is a day many Kenyans remember well. 20 years ago, police brutally broke up a pro-democracy rally. At least 20 people were killed, hundreds arrested, detained and tortured. It's a day known here as Saba Saba, Swahili for 7-7. The 1997 commemoration of Saba Saba was also met by violence between police and protesters demanding constitutional reforms. 14 people are said to have been killed by police. Many agree that issues being raised by the opposition are real. They just hope that this political grandstanding between the two leading coalitions will not take the country back to its dark, violent days. Catherine Soy, Al Jazeera, Kisumu, Western Kenya.
Well, the rising political tensions come at a time of increasing concern over safety. Kenya has been hit by a string of attacks over the last month. The most recent took place at the weekend in the coastal areas of Gamba and Hindi. 29 people were killed. But that wasn't as bad as last month's attack in the same area when gunmen opened fire in the town of Mfeketoni and killed 65 people. The Somali-based group Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for that attack, but the Kenyan president Uhuru Kenyatta blamed what he called local political networks.
The attack in Lamu was well planned, orchestrated, and politically motivated ethnic violence against the Kenyan community with the intention of profiling and evicting them for political reasons. This, therefore, was not an Al-Shabaab terrorist attack. Evidence indicates that local political networks were involved in the planning and execution of the heinous crime.
Well, let's now bring in our guests for today's discussion. From New York, Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, Horn of Africa's security analyst, and from Nairobi, the Kenyan capital, Dismas Mokua, political analyst and deputy president of Africa Access, a consultancy advising companies and doing business in Africa. Gentlemen, thank you both for bringing on Inside Story today. If I can start with you, Abdullahi, in New York, what do you see as the underlying cause of the recent violence? Are they internal factors or external factors?
Thank you so much for having me. I think it's a combination of both. But I think for me the fundamental question is there is a serious acknowledgement from those who are saying this is external or this is an internal problem, that there is a serious breakdown of security. So I thought the president, for me, the most important thing was not for the president to blame. If indeed there were internal political networks that he thinks were involved in this, the easiest way is for him to direct all the relevant security and judicial institutions to take the responsibility. But that has happened to an extent. But I think for me, the president missed an opportunity to be presidential. He missed an opportunity to rise above the political bickering in an environment where there is tremendous amount of division. You know, if you remember last year, September, when we had a similar attack in Westgate, the president was very presidential. He looked like somebody who had his pulse on the hands of the Kenyans. But this time round, I think the president played a more political role than being a leader that he's supposed to be.
Dismas Mokua in Nairobi, why do you think Uhuru Kenyatta blamed the Mbeketoni attack on his political opponents when Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for the attack? Is it far-fetched to link the attacks to politics, you think?
The president did blame the Code political coalition simply because he wanted to move responsibility and give him time to reorganize his troops. Because when you look at the Kenyan constitution, really, the buck stops with the president, and when he was sworn into office, he sought to protect the lives and properties of all Kenyans. And really, it doesn't matter whether it's an internal factor or an external factor that caused all these attacks. Kenyans have got a very valid expectation that the president will secure their properties and their lives. So really, it doesn't matter for the ordinary Kenyan on the motive behind these killings or which organization is doing this. And the president actually, when addressing the nation, he said they had political intelligence, but for some reason the security forces were not able to nip in the bud these attacks. And that makes everybody wonder then that if the state had the intelligence prior, and it said that they had the intelligence 4 days before the attack, what really happened? Why did this political violence take place? Why did people lose lives and their properties? So that's the underlying reason. And the president now has got a very unique opportunity to celebrate a new beginning by really focusing on the issues that ACORD is calling for. And one of the things they're calling for is the review of our security system.
Right.
And really, it doesn't matter who is at the State House, who is running Kenya, but people want to feel safe and secure. They want to be sure that their properties and lives are secure, and that one has to be guaranteed by the state.
Right. Before we get into what the opposition is demanding and whether or not that will be met, let's talk about Saba Saba, which was the name of the rally that Raila Odinga held in Nairobi today. Saba Saba is, of course, a day which has historical significance in Kenyan politics. Do you think that holding this rally on Saba Saba Day legitimizes Dismas, the opposition's cause? Does it give them legitimacy to demand what they're asking for, right?
Well, you know, when you look at the history of Saba Saba, this started 20 years ago when people were fighting for liberation in Kenya. And it's a very emotional day because it's a result of Saba Saba that Kenya has got a new constitution. But Raila Odinga, being an enigma in the Kenyan political space, has decided to take advantage of this. If you recall,
do you think Raila
after
Odinga
the
is
last elections
exploiting
when Raila Odinga accepted. Of course, Raila, being the enigmatic politician he is really exploiting it, and he has been able to rebrand himself and reinvent himself. He is now a force in the Kenyan political system. And this was not the case 3 months ago when he left for the US. So for me, really, I think that he's taken advantage of Saba Saba to reinvent himself and become a force in the political space once more.
Abdullahi, in New York, I want to talk about Al-Shabaab. To what extent does Al-Shabaab benefit from this political bickering right now that's going on in Kenya? Will this change the nature of their attacks in Kenya?
I think this is a godsend opportunity to the group. You know, in a situation like this, during a national crisis, when you have, you know, a national breakdown as far as insecurity is concerned, you would expect leaders, you know, to have cool heads. You'll expect people to come and rally around, if, for instance, it's the executive or the parliament, and to ensure that everybody would feel safe, even if it just symbolically. But I think for Al-Shabaab, this is a massive public relation bonanza. If as a president, it is your word against the word of Al-Shabaab, then you have a serious legitimacy crisis with you. Because Al-Shabaab claimed, and we don't have records where Al-Shabaab claims something that they have not done, the attacks that they have not carried out. Do they exaggerate? Absolutely. But they do not tend to say that we've carried an attack when they haven't. But when Al-Shabaab comes out after Impeketoni attacks, and they say that they are the ones who actually carried out the attacks, and the president comes out and blames it on his on domestic political opponents, we have a problem. But I want to highlight a couple of things here, too, though. They are, I mean, since Kenya went into Somalia October 16, 2011, we've had probably over 90 attacks now. And we have a serious problem in terms of parsing out which are some of these attacks, some of these attacks are carried out by Al-Shabaab, which we know, like the Westgate attack, some of the attacks that were carried out in churches, let's say in Garissa. Some of them we know are work of opportunistic criminal groups in Kenya, we know that for a fact. And some of these attacks are done by Al-Qaeda cells, sorry, Al-Shabaab cells
inside Kenya.
In Kenya.
Right.
But the government, yes. But the government hasn't been able to clearly identify some of these things. But then now we have, after Raila Odinga, who went to Boston University for a few months, and during that time the opposition looked, you know, like impotent. Now that he's come back and he's taking advantage, like my colleague has said, of the paralysis within the government. And this is not an accident, because the president and the deputy president are both indicted by the ICC.
Right.
So for the better part of the administration, which is slightly over a year, they have invested all their political capital on trying to demonize the ICC, because they know these cases are an existential threat to their leadership. So it's now that they are scrambling, and Odinga, regardless of the fact that he's providing any, you know, leadership per se in this issue, he has re-energized his base. He's brought these discussions to the fore, whether he's demanding for a national dialogue, or whether he's saying, you know, let's implement the Truth and Justice and Reconciliation report, or whether he's saying that the Electoral Commission needs to be disbanded.
Right.
And all these are issues that are fairly legitimate.
Right. Let me just ask Dismas, before we get into the politics a bit more, because I do want to talk about some of the opposition's demand. Dismas, who do you think is benefiting most from this current situation, the current chaos, the insecurity and so on? Is it the opposition? Is it Al-Shabaab, or is it the Kenyan government?
Well, for me, I think the principal beneficiary of all this confusion is Raila Odinga. As indicated after the elections, he was limping away, and he had lost all his political muscles in Kenya. But now he's taking advantage of Sabasaba, and he's been able to re-energize his political base. He's been able to get back his troops in order, although a few of them are saying that they're not interested in these political rallies and the national dialogue. But it's given him a bit of power and a bit of oomph in his conversation.
Right. But
and
what
a number of people are coming up and saying that, in
opposition...
fact, Mr. Raila Odinga...
Sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make clear, what exactly does the opposition want from the government when they talk about security and corruption? Do they have a plan? What do they want to talk about specifically?
Well, you know, the coalition has got so many issues they want to discuss. One of them is about inclusion in government, and they're accusing the president, Uhuru Kenyatta, of failing to form an inclusion government that captures the face of Kenya. So they're claiming that the government has been largely formed by two groups, two tribes, and the rest of the nation has been left out. And then the second issue is about the equitable distribution of the national resources. They are claiming that a number of people are beneficiaries of the state procurement system that if you do not come from a particular community, you are not able to access this contract. So they want to see a fair ground. And when it comes to security, of course, he's really taking advantage of that and saying that it's unacceptable for the president to have an intelligence briefing beforehand that there's going to be a criminal activity, and then the police failed to do that. So what he's calling is for the president to initiate a dialogue so that then they can discuss these issues. And he has said no to parliament because he says that President Kenyatta's coalition controls parliament, and they are not able to engage in a useful debate.
So
what
he
then
wants
happens
that if the president doesn't meet these demands?
Multi-sectoral. It's going to be interesting to see really what he tables, because that has been one of his major undoings, that he raises the tensions in the country very high. He raises expectations very high. But you know, when the rubber hits the road, it doesn't come up with a solution. But his coalition has indicated that they'll be looking for, as an alternative, they'll be looking at mass action to rally the entire nation and demand for institutional reforms to ensure that we eradicate corruption, to ensure that the entire security machinery has been audited, and so that we're able to protect lives and properties.
Right.
And then on the issue of the resources, he wants it to be more transparent. That when people are applying for government jobs or government contracts, it should be purely done on merit, and that your second name is not supposed to betray you, which is the common saying in Kenya, that if you come from a particular ethnic community, that can guarantee you a high-profile government job, it can guarantee you a contract. But again, if you come from another community, you are not able to access these factors of production. I mean, a good example one may want to use is similar to the Sunni and Shiite Muslims, that are depending on where you come from, it could be a benefit or a disadvantage.
Do you agree with this, Abdullahi, that the issue of ethnicity is still so prevalent in Kenya today at all levels that politicians are sometimes even trying to exploit this?
I think it's the only currency in Kenya for our politicians.
But you would think that they would have learned from 2007, 2008, and the indictment at the ICC and so on.
That is if we think that these guys are rational human beings. And, you know, personally, I think the expectations, this is just my personal view and I share with a couple of other people. I've learned to manage my expectations as far as the current crop of Kenyan politicians are concerned. Because if they really care about this, even people who are opposed to, let me just say this, ethnicity is the only currency in Kenya. I mean, if you look at William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta's coalition, this is probably the most counterintuitive coalition you'll find anywhere around. Since the introduction of multi-party politics, where Saba played a critical role, the two ethnic communities that Uhuru represent, that is the Kikuyu, the largest ethnic group, and the Kalenjin, who live in the Rift Valley, have been fighting. And that includes the 2007-2008, where the majority of people who were affected were actually from these two ethnic communities. So in 2013, them working together for their own personal interest actually ensured them becoming president and the deputy president.
Right, marginalizing the Luo community once again.
Not necessarily just them. Anybody who haven't voted for them is essentially looked at as not as somebody who is against them. So they are de facto frozen out of anything. But there isn't any serious, if you will, reconciliation between even these two communities. So I think for politicians, because they don't have any alternative policy intervention, so fear, particularly saying that I'm the only one who is standing between you and the other ethnic group, has become their standard default setting when they go around.
Right.
Like right now, majority of the Kikuyus are saying that they're coming out to defend one of their own, that is their President Kenyatta's presidency. And this is essentially because symbolically people think that once one of your own is in power, chances are that you'll be able to benefit from the national cake, which is not actually true. This is just an elite contract. It doesn't involve the others. But people like Odinga will also use that, trying to make the Kikuyus look bad. Whereas an average Kikuyu would actually is way far off of benefiting from the state than a Luo who's from Odinga's group, who is a golf buddy of the president or anybody who's closer to him.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask Dismas this, actually, because you're in Nairobi, Dismas. We're talking about ethnicity and politics here, and you know how politicians have used this card very often in Kenyan politics. But what about Kenyans, the Kenyan on the street? Does ethnicity still play a role today in everyday life in Kenya? Are people concerned about this still today, or you know, do they just dismiss it and go on with their lives?
Well, you know, as you've indicated in the prior conversations, really, the coalitions in Kenya are not formed by ideologies or philosophies. They're rather formed by political leaders. And the political leaders, as soon as they take office, then they use those as factors of production. And what tends to happen in Kenya today, it depends on where your political leader lies. Well, the Kenyans are very alive to that message because, you know, most of the time they're held captive by the political leaders. So whatever President Kenyatta says to his community, or Deputy President Ruto or Raila Odinga, whatever they tell their communities will jump. They'll not ask why. I mean, it's as if you're asking somebody to jump. They don't ask how high, they ask why. So they really feel it down. But unfortunately, for the common man in the streets, they're being used as a pawn. They're not beneficiaries of like for instance, the new constitution. If, for instance, President Kenyatta is in office, it's only a few of his friends who are beneficiary of his presidency, not the entire Kikuyu community. When Raila Odinga was a prime minister, it was Raila Odinga and a number of his friends who are beneficiaries of his premiership, not the entire Luo community. So I think as a nation, we are really in a bad space that politicians tend to use us as they deem fit. For instance, during the 2007-2008 elections, the reason why we had political violence is because the two tribal leaders could not read from the same script. And the reason the last election there was no violence is because the political leaders of the Kikuyu community and Kalenjin community decided to work together. And when they do this, they do not consult the people. They just meet at a boardroom somewhere and take a decision. And then they now go back to the community and say that now we're going to take over power, we're going to be beneficiaries of the state resources. So all these coalitions being formed every single day have absolutely nothing to do with the common man in the streets. Right. It's not about any philosophy, it's not about an ideology, but it's about greedy politicians who want to make their tribesmen feel insecure if they do not vote in a particular direction. Okay. And it's been happening in Kenya all along. Like, for instance, for the Prime Minister Raila Odinga, if you're in his political party, if you are from his community and you do not toe what he tells you, you lose a political seat. I mean, there's a gentleman called Raphael Tuju who did great work in his constituency, but because he doesn't get along with the Prime Minister, he cannot go to Parliament. And there are millions of those cases in Kenya.
There are a lot of cases like that.
And I think there'll be need for a lot of education for us to realize.
Right, a lot of education.
For us to realize that the politicians really use us every 5 years.
Right. Yeah. Let me ask Abdullahi about the current situation and how you see it evolving in the coming months and the coming years. You know, Kenya has been on the brink before. We've seen violence. We've seen ethnic violence in 2007, 2008. Do you think we're likely to go there again, given the current political tensions? Will the politicians exploit this once again? Will we see more ethnic violence in Kenya?
The 2007 looked like an anomaly, but the 2007 was a natural arc that Kenya was on since the introduction of multi-party politics. Since 1991, all our politics have been organized around ethnicity, like we've discussed before. And, you know, and in every subsequent election, that is 92, 97, we had ethnic violence, but not of this proportion. And it was centered, let's say, the epicenter of this electoral violence are largely the Rift Valley, because it's the melting pot of so many ethnic groups, but it's the Kalenjins and the Kikuyus who have issues. And then the Mombasa, and as well as the slums in Nairobi. 2002, all these ethnic communities came together. So was the Luos and the Kikuyus came together, and they are the largest purveyors. Their political leaders are the largest purveyors of violence. So, like my colleague explained, there was no violence, and so it's very hard to see. However, all the indicators of because election violence, the election is just a switch, it's just a trigger. The underlying structural drivers of conflict, whether it's the land question, unemployment, youth disenfranchisement, all those factors are very, very ripe. And on top of that, if you add this narrative of one ethnic community or two benefiting than the rest, then we are not headed in the right direction, and it needs to be diffused now.
Okay, thank you so very much. We're going to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you very much, Abdullahi Boru Halakhe in New York and Dismas Mokua in Nairobi. Thank you both for being on this edition of Inside Story. And as always, of course, you can leave your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Bah Thibault. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.